right, well, we should get started. I'm going to pray first. Lord, we thank you that we do have the opportunity to gather and learn some things about Scripture and the context of the Old Testament and eventually getting on into the New Testament. And also with Dax in the other room, that he can be addressing questions about grace and how we think as a group of elders in terms of doctrine, help him to think clearly, to answer questions well and thoroughly. And we pray for the same here, that you would just help me to communicate some things that are important, some reasons why we should care about what the biblical world can teach us through discoveries. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, this is Bible and Archaeology. If you're looking for where does grace stand, you should go through that wall to the other side, and that's where Dax is. But if you want to do some archaeology stuff, this is the place. This is the correct location. Now, before I forget it, we have had a small donation of some magazines. Are you familiar with Biblical Archaeology Review? Anybody familiar with that publication? Okay, there is a box. How many, just roughly? 20 or 30 out there, older issues, and you are free to look at them and take them home, bring them back, whatever. So I can almost guarantee that somewhere in those issues are going to be some of the things we talk about tonight, because what I'm going to do tonight is sort of introduce you kind of philosophically to how scholars, at least how believing scholars, confessional scholars, in other words, scholars who, assign credibility to the Scriptures. They may not believe, they may not articulate inspiration and inerrancy the way you do. Some will, some won't. But they do assign a validity to the Old and New Testament. And so when they approach things archaeologically speaking, there's going to be sort of highlights. Now, we're going to do that, but I'm going to tell you along the way as well. I'm also going to show you some things that sort of create problems. You're going to get more of that when we hit next week with the Exodus. Just trust me, that is the pit of despair. If you know anything about Old Testament history, or maybe you've seen the recent documentary, Patterns of Evidence, you can get lost real quickly in that subject and really come out with no conclusion at all. So we're going to do some of that as well. I just want you to sort of get an overview of how, again, believing scholars think about this material. And then a few examples of, where it means something, okay, where it matters in some way. So, limitations, uses, and problems. The first thing we need to fix in our mind is that archaeology cannot prove the Bible in a theological sense. Now, I'm just going to make this up because it's not this neat of a picture. But let's say somebody finally returns to Jericho and starts digging in that place again. It hasn't been dug for decades, and only little portions of the city of Jericho have been excavated. But let's say they go back there and they just find like every detail in the book of Joshua, there in the results of their dig. Now that proves something happened there, something cataclysmic. It proves the walls came down and all sorts of things like that. And you can make that argument now as well, again, from the archaeological material. We'll look at that in future weeks too. But what you can't prove is that God was the cause. Okay, so you can prove events happen. Archaeology can validate the coherence of the biblical story. It can validate that an event happened, but it can never give you, the divine cause, because you can't dig up God, all right? You can't do that. So we need to be careful about how we think about what archaeology is doing, what it can do, what it can't do. It's just inherently limited. And since I'm a text guy, when I was in grad school, I used to irritate the archaeology people. Because I would always say, well, that's fine. You got this object here, and you're basically, I probably wouldn't say it this badly, but you're kind of just making up stuff as to what it was for. What you need is a text. You need some writing on that thing. And there you go. That's going to tell you more. And there's this constant, fight in the academy between the text people and the archaeology people. I mean, it's all important. But, when it comes to archaeology, there's some inherent limitations to it. And there's inherent limitations to text, too, because how do we know if we're precisely interpreting something that's written? And there's just limitations. Archaeology cannot always or even frequently prove the historicity of biblical people and events. Okay, there is no direct proof of people like Moses, people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Okay, no one's ever dug anything up that says, hey, this is the biblical Abraham held this jar or something like that. Even if it had Abraham's name on it, or Jacob's name. It's a very common name that you will find in inscriptions. But how do you know that Jacob is like that Jacob from the Old Testament? Well, you don't. Again, what you can do, what archaeology will do, is they'll say, hey, the name Jacob was a common Semitic name. It's used all over the place in the ancient world where the patriarchs were supposed to live. So we know the biblical writers aren't just making this thing up. It was in this place. So this is kind of the area of where the patriarchs lived. I mean, you start to build a circumstantial, evidential case that illustrates the coherence of what the Bible is telling you. But there'd be almost no way to dig up the biblical figure. Now, if you were down, in Egypt, maybe somewhere, and somebody, dug up a sarcophagus that had the Egyptian equivalent of the name Moses on it, well, that's probably a good deal. Odds are that that's the guy, okay? That would get you really close, but there really isn't anything that spectacular. Later on in biblical history, there are some controversial artifacts that do have the name David on them, and scholars fight endlessly over whether that's the real David, or should it say David? Does it mean something else? We'll get to that too. But that's unusual. Usually you have to think like, a crime drama, detective story. You are building a circumstantial case for the validity, the coherence of this biblical story, so that when you look at the biblical story and you look at the archaeological data, it would be really unreasonable to draw any other conclusion than, well, whoever wrote the biblical story knew what they were talking about. Okay, that would be unreasonable to deny that. So that's, again, what believing archaeologists are shooting for, to build a case using physical data for the biblical story. What it can do, again, as I've been mentioning, is provide backgrounding for events and people and a storyline, a narrative. It can demonstrate coherence of these things, that there's no reason to think that this didn't happen, that there wasn't an Abraham, okay, that sort of thing. That's the goal. Occasionally, again, you will get a biblical person or place. Usually it's the Davidic time period onward more recently. You will get specific mentions of kings like Hezekiah, okay, Jehu in a stela, which is an upright object with an inscription on it. Situated at the right time in the right place and mentioned in conjunction with, say, an Assyrian king that they're supposed to have done stuff with in the Bible. You will find that in more recent periods of history. So you do find some of those. You just don't find a whole lot of them. But, the ones that are there are important. And of course, archaeology can illumine our understanding of ancient customs and beliefs. Now, I do want to say something about this. I have a bit of a bone to pick here with, again, not the archaeologists per se, but sort of some of the assumptions that Bible believers like myself sort of bring to the enterprise. Archaeological stuff concerns a lot more than, oh, look, ancient people used Tupperware. They used pots and pans. They built fires. They built buildings with walls. They went potty outside the house. Okay, it's more than just your mundane life stuff. There are things in the Bible and that archaeology illuminates that really gets at the heart of what an Israelite would have been thinking in terms of what they believed and how they thought about something they believed. So there's a religious or theological element to some stuff that archaeologists have found that may not sort of conform to ideas we have because we're modern. When we read biblical stories, we tend to think that Abraham thought about God precisely the way that John Calvin did, or precisely the way that John Piper does, or I do, or you do. And they're different people, and their conception of certain things is going to be different because they lived 2,000 years ago in a completely different culture, in a completely different setting, and the way they thought about their world and who made their world and why they made that world and what's going on in the spiritual realm, that sort of thing, can differ quite a bit from the way that you think about it, the way that I think about it, and the way that some church history figure or theology writer would think about it. One of the most valuable things you can do, not only for the sake of what we'll look at tonight, but just generally when it comes to Bible study, is get it fixed in your mind that the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. Corollary to that, it wasn't written by us either. A biblical writer will say things because he's communicating to his audience using their language, expressing things the way they would understand, not the way you and I might. There's a disconnect there. And sometimes it's kind of dramatic. It's unexpected. But when you take, again, a material object, you go back to the scriptures, and then you read the scriptures in light of what this thing either is or says, you go, oh, okay, that's what they were talking about. That's why it's expressed this way. And we have to, again, try to have the Israelite in our heads when we do this. And archaeology helps us to do that. We're going to talk a little bit about chronology next week because that's a big deal, but sometimes archaeology helps situate an event in real time. Have you ever wondered about this? Like, how do they know that something happened in 300 BC? Like, really, how do they know that? Or 4000 BC? Because it's not always things like carbon-14. Again, that's material remains that that method applies to. How do they know this stuff? And the answer is ancient chronological systems that you find and hope that something in this one is going to match something in that one. So that you can marry them and then start to make a chronology in real time that you can correlate with astronomy, because that is how real time is measured. Ancient people did lots of astronomy, and sometimes they mention what they're doing. Eclipses, phases of the moon, other events. You get one of those mentioned in a text with a king name at a specific place, and then you find another text with that same king's name in it. There you go. You have a linchpin now to start adding numbers of things like king lists, how long they reigned, what they did, that sort of thing. That's how it's done, and there are gaps in the record. It's not a neat system. And as we'll find out next week, there's lots to fight about that can take you in dramatically different directions. So some problems, again, when you read archaeology or you listen to it on TV, a lot of mainstream archaeologists will have a very skeptical outlook toward the events of the Bible. And it's because of the way they sort of approach their own periodization of ancient history. It's usually done by metals. Chalcolithic, which is copper, you got the Bronze Age, you got the Iron Age, you got all of those sorts of things. And archaeologists do that because of the technology available. They weren't making iron until XYZ time period because we've never found iron prior to that. Okay, that would make sense. That, okay, now that we know kind of when iron making was perfected, or at least you could do it well enough to actually have something useful. We know now that if we find an object of this chemical composition or metallurgical composition somewhere else, probably at the same time period. Okay, so there are some assumptions that go into it. And sometimes the scheme that derives out of that process will apparently be in conflict with something in the Bible. So that's why there are some disagreements. Chronological issues are a big one as to when something happened and who was there and all that, because there are different chronological systems. And again, the expectations that all of this raises. And by that I mean some people just presuppose that the Bible's just not reliable from out of the gate, so we're not going to care. Okay, what it says, we're not even going to try to synchronize things. Other people will say, no, it is a good source, so we do need to try to work with the data here. Generally, I would say archaeology has proven to be the friend, overwhelmingly, and not the foe of biblical history. Again, there are problems, and we'll hit some of those. It doesn't answer every question, and it does create some difficulties. Evangelicals, I think, tend to ignore some of the problems because they typically do things for apologetic reasons. They want to kind of shelter you from some of the problems. Anybody who knows me knows I'm not going to shelter you. I'm just not going to do it because there's no good payoff for it. Nothing you will encounter or hear on a TV show or read on the internet about a biblical problem. Guess what, folks? Somebody has thought about that before and done a lot of research on it. Nothing just happens in isolation. It's just that usually the person picking on the Bible for whatever point won't tell you where to find the contrarian opinion or all of the data. But there are people who work in the field who do that. So you shouldn't be troubled. By and large, you're not going to wind up in a situation where there's this hopeless impasse. And if there is something like that, the honest thing to do is say, hey, we don't know. Could be this, could be that, who knows? We'll just wait and see if somebody else digs something up that helps over here. And, that's happened historically. I think we also, again, need to commit ourselves to interpreting Scripture in light of the ancient context. And the examples I'm going to give you, I think, will make that kind of apparent. Not all of them, but some of them are going to present new ideas to you. That if we had an Israelite sitting here in the front row, I'd probably have to just walk over and poke them to wake them up, because it's not going to be anything that's a surprise to them. They're going to be used to thinking in a certain way that we're not. They're not going to be troubled by it at all, but we might be, because it's new to us. First example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from Genesis 1 through 11 tonight. Let me do a quick time check, because I want to leave time for questions. Hey, I'm not doing too bad. What do you know? I'm going to go through Genesis 1 to 11 and pick out a few artifacts that sort of matter for how you read those chapters. The Shabaka stone, otherwise contains something that scholars have called the Memphite theology. How many of you have ever heard of the Memphite theology? Gold star. It's not something out of a video game. Okay, you don't count. Use the word you were. Rick's raising his head. He's heard of it. The Memphite theology is something that comes from Egypt. Now, here you have what looks like an innocent-looking stone. Not terribly artistic. Hey, who can't scroll out a square and then, things pointing off of it? Well, there's more to it than that. You might be able to see, at least on the left, there's actually writing on it. And over here there's writing. You can't really tell it back here. But if you look at it real closely, there's a text on it. And here, someone, probably a graduate student that was enslaved to their institution, had to hand draw. This is what they do to graduate students, by the way. Had to hand draw the Shabaka stone. Okay, you want to graduate, you need to hand draw this thing and don't miss anything. So this is what the whole stone looks like. So there's a lot of writing on this thing, even down near the square here. And what this is, it's a creation story. Now the reason it's significant, that it draws a lot of attention, we'll superimpose that over the hand drawing, It's a creation story that typically, let's go back here, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner I have 600 to 500 BC. Most scholars think that this is when this inscription was made. It is the only other source, other than Genesis 1, that describes creation by a deity through the spoken word. Okay, it's the only one. Most of what happens in Genesis is very Mesopotamian in its context. We're going to look at parallel flood stories tonight. But there's a lot of things that Genesis 1 through 11 aligns up pretty interestingly with Mesopotamia. This is the exception. And again, if this is the date, this would have been something compiled or written during what period of Israel's history? What's going on in 600 to 500 BC? Begins with an E. The exile, yes. Now, this is during the period of the exile. Now, right away, since this is so unusual, and you can find a specific reference to, in this case, it's the god Ptah, P-T-A-H, who creates with the spoken word. All the other deities everywhere like use stuff. They kill each other and split them in half. And okay, you're part of use the sky now and part of use the land. And they do all sorts of bizarre stuff. This one doesn't. So since it's so unusual, it causes people to wonder, and there are other reasons why people wonder this. If we take the biblical chronology at face value, Moses wouldn't have been alive when this was written. So how did it get in there? Maybe we have a later insertion in Genesis 1, or maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe we have a later composition for Genesis 1. So what I'm introducing you to this not to stake out a position, okay? I'm just saying that when you hear people question whether something was written by a biblical author that you've heard traditionally wrote something, there might be a good reason they're asking the question. It's not that a bunch of scholars sit in a room and say, oh, we hate Genesis. Let's just shoot at it. Somebody make something up so we can shoot at it. No, they're actually asking a question. And that kind of circulates, in the academy, and people talk about it, and they come up with theories, or they just say, well, let's abandon ship, or we think we have an answer, whatever. So it's not all, again, kind of conspiratorial. There are actually good reasons why people ask certain questions. And the Memphite theology is a famous one. Now, other people have come along and say, well, yeah, this is the dominant view, 25th dynasty, which is 600 to 500 BC. But this is James Allen, who's an Egyptologist. He teaches at Brown now. Advances in our understanding of Egyptian grammar and theology have now made a date in the 19th century more likely. So move it back to the New Kingdom, 1200, 1100 BC. Now, some of you think, oh, yeah, that might be Moses' time, because that's the era of Ramses. But if you're a defender of the early date of the Exodus, if you're familiar with the competition between the two dates, you're still not happy. We'll talk about the dating systems next week, but roughly, when it comes to the Exodus, you got two major options. If you take the numbers in the Exodus account, and very specifically, there's a reference in 1 Kings 6:1, that the fourth year of Solomon was the 480th anniversary after the Exodus from Egypt. Solomon is datable astronomically. Okay, that would be 966 BC. Do the math, you wind up in 1446 BC for the Exodus. That is the conservative traditional position. That is not what Hollywood said, because we all know that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. He wasn't alive in 1446 BC. He was alive 200 years later, where maybe this was written. So you can have Moses know about the Shabaka stone, but your chronology can't take the numbers literally. You see how, again, one problem creates another one, and then you get something solved, and another problem's created over here. This is how the whole enterprise works. And you have scholars that try to, again, because the Bible is this comprehensive document that gives us, this long history, across millennia. And so archaeologists and textual scholars are trying to make it all fit together. And just when you've got one thing settled over here, it's whack-a-mole time over there. You got another problem pop up. And you go hit that one and something else pops up over there. It's a constant struggle to try to get an integrated picture to align what a text says, in this case the Bible, with physical objects and what they might say. So this one, again, is kind of famous because of the spoken word creation. And if we want to, in a Q&A, if we want to talk about Mosaic authorship and stuff like that, we can do that. Another example, this one I think is even more interesting. This is something called the Sumerian king list. It is just what it sounds like. It is a king list, a list of kings from, let me be careful with my words here. In the Sumerian king list, it starts with the first king in human history, all the way past the flood and beyond. This has a remarkable resemblance, or at least correlatable things in it, to the genealogies of Genesis 5. This is why it's important. 2000 BC is the oldest source. It's in Sumerian. Again, a list of kings before and after the flood. And some of the surface connections. You have very, very long lives in the Sumerian king list. Now, we're familiar with this from Genesis 5. So-and-so lived 900 years, or 800 years, or 600 years, okay? That's nothing compared to this one. This is like 50,000 years and 120,000 years. It's just like ridiculous. But nevertheless, there is a correlation I'm going to show you in a moment. So we have a list of kings who lived before the flood, then the flood comes. Great flood. Then after the flood, their lifespans get shorter. Just like what book? Well, just like Genesis. Genesis 5 has 10 generations from Adam to Noah. The Sumerian king list, depending on the version, there's more than one version of it. There's more than one object on which it was inscribed. Some of them have, one of the versions at least has 10. Some of them have 8 or 9. But it's before or after the flood, lifespans real long, and then they get shorter. So when this was discovered, that drew people's attention. When it was discovered and translated, and it's like, wow, we've heard that before. So people wondered, well, is there any sort of correlation? Well, here you have the comparative lists. This is biblical material. The Sethite line, the Canaanite line. This is Genesis 5, Genesis 11. Forget the North Arabian. I don't know why they stuck that in there. Sumerian kings. Here's the king list. Now, I've put a square around 2 of them because they're the ones that are the most interesting. Notice we have En-Medur-Ana of Sippar. He is the 7th from the beginning. I'll say that again because I want it to echo in your head. He is the 7th from the beginning. His name means chief of the powers of Dor-Anki, and Dor-Anki means the meeting place of heaven and earth. This character is also known as En-Medur-Anki. He is known in Mesopotamian literature, Sumerian and Akkadian stuff, for being extremely wise and being taken into the presence of the gods, specifically the sun and the moon gods, where he spent time in the divine council learning lots of cool stuff and then transmitting his wisdom to the people on earth. So he was taken by the gods to live with them for a while. Who does this sound like? Who in the Bible is the 7th from Adam? Enoch. Why is Enoch noteworthy? Because he was translated to the heavens, to heaven, and did not see death. He went to live with God. So again, when this kind of stuff's getting translated, people are going, okay, that's a little too close. You're like, what is going on here? Why do we have the seventh person in this list characterized in various texts the way Enoch is? Why is that? This is a quotation just to sort of summarize En Medur Anki. The figure of Enoch is to some degree modeled on En Medur Anki. Now this is what the mainstream would say. Because we all know that the Israelites of all ancient civilizations, that the biblical writers were too stupid to write anything on their own. They have to copy from everyone. Yeah, I'm being sarcastic, I hope you can tell. So the figure of Enoch is to some degree modeled on En Medur Anki, founder of the guild of the Barus, or Babylonian diviners, the wise men, one of the class of wise men. Enoch is listed in Genesis as the seventh in line from Adam. Sumerian king list, the seventh king is En Medur Anki or En Medur Ana. Sippar, the city ruled by his king, was a center of the cult of Shamash, who's the sun god. Enoch is associated with the solar calendar in Judaism, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. His age is given as 365 years in Genesis. Why is 365 interesting? Because it's the number of days in a solar year. Okay? By the way, his lifespan's the shortest in the list. He's an anomaly by hundreds of years. But 365 is like, oh. The astronomical book contained in 1st Enoch presupposes a calendar of 364 days. And again, that's a book about Enoch, so it's pretty close there. En Medur Anki was also the founder of a guild of diviners and recipient of revelations. So people, again, have noticed this, and the Sumerian king list becomes important for thinking about this stuff. Let's do another one here. Now, is Aaron back there? Oh, yeah, there you are. I'll tell you in a moment to flip to that link, that PDF. Who's this guy? Ziusudra. He is the hero in the Sumerian version of the flood. He's the equivalent of Noah, if you align the lists. Is that a coincidence? It's kind of hard to argue that's a coincidence. Because, again, this guy's the good guy in the Wendell, Grinnell, Prism number 62 there, the one source. He is the hero of the flood story in the 10 list version. Now, go ahead and flip up. Yeah. Now, if you want this, if you like math, okay, there's one victim out there. If you like math, you might like this. This is an article I can send to you because what the Sumerian king list has really stimulated in the academy in biblical scholarship is some people have noticed. Scroll up a little bit, just scroll a little bit. Keep going, have a party. There you go, keep going. This guy plots it all out. Okay. Right there. Up a little bit. Someone has noticed that I don't know what happened there. Okay. Anyway, the names in the Sumerian king list, all of them except one, are divisible by 5. And they also, all of them in the Sumerian king list are multiples of 60. There's a relationship between 5 and 60. 12 times 5 is 60. 5 years, 12 months each year. That sort of thing. And so everybody in the field knows that there's some sort of mathematical cipher to the Sumerian king list. So the question is there one for Genesis 5? In other words, is there a reason why the years are so inordinately long? Maybe the point is not just to give us literal ages for the people in the list. And again, that's not a denial that the people in the list were real people, but maybe the numbers are designed to telegraph certain ideas. Because in the case of the Sumerian king list, that is absolutely certain. And there's a reason why the numbers 5 and 12 and 60 were religiously important to the Sumerians. And so the question becomes, well, is the biblical writer trying to convey a similar set of ideas using his numbers? Is he taking a swipe at the way what the Sumerians believed in the way their number symbolism worked? That's what this article is about. I tend to think that there is something to that, because basically you can account for all of the names in Genesis 5, well, in all the antediluvian lists and the post-diluvian lists in Genesis. The outliers are Enoch and Methuselah. And they're not really outliers, because if you play with the numbers, again, this is like Sudoku. If you play with the numbers, you can make them fit the system too. But is that artificial? Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But here's the point. This is an artifact that when it was translated, people noticed certain pretty unmistakable points of correlation to this list in the Bible. And then the issue became, okay, is one sort of are we religious, or do we have two math geeks going at it theologically in what they want to communicate? There are certain points that the Sumerians would have flagged in their head that this number associated with this name in this place conveys a religious idea, a religious belief. So is the writer of Genesis sort of giving that a poke in the eye? Or are they trying to articulate their own theology through it? The article, the title of it is Biblical Math as Heilgeschichte, which is a nice German name, Gesundheit. It's a nice German name for sacred history. So the guy who wrote the article suspects, again, that the numbers transmit theology, theological ideas about the God of Israel in this case. See, we don't think anything like this. None of this stuff even pops into our heads. To someone writing in the first millennium BC or earlier, someone who read that would have known, okay, I know what you're doing here, and I don't like it, or I do like it. Okay, they would have known instantly what the game was. But we tend to, again, read things the way we're used to reading, as sort of just, it's just a table of numbers. What else would it be? It tells us how old somebody was. Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it tells us something bigger. But we just don't think that way. Let's go back to the slides. And the article mentions a couple other approaches too. Okay, now I don't have point it right at you. There we go. Here's another one. I won't spend too much time here. If you've read Unseen Realm, you would have seen this term before, the Apkallu. But this is something called the Era Epic, okay, or the Poem of Era, also called the Myth of the Seven Sages. This is a tablet that, for lack of a better way to express it, is the point-for-point correlation to the very weird story in Genesis 6:1 through 4 about the sons of God cohabiting with human women and producing Nephilim, giants. That story, in Mesopotamian garb, is told in this tablet, in these tablets. Now, the reason I point this out is that a lot of this material was not really collected and published sort of as a systematic study until 2010. So it's actually pretty recent, which is one reason you should get my book, because I go through all that. A lot of commentaries on Genesis, for instance, will never have heard of this stuff because they're just published earlier than 2010. That's just what happens. But this one, again, gives us the point-for-point story. And to make the episode short, what the Mesopotamian story tries to communicate is that, and again, this is written during the time of Marduk, the time of Babylon, when Marduk is the chief deity of the pantheon for the Mesopotamians, and Babylon is it. And so this story explains to everyone who can read it why Babylon is the greatest city in the world, the apex of human civilization. And the reason for that is because, well, we're so smart, we're so awesome, because the knowledge that we have, the civilization we have, we inherited from the gods. And before the flood, the gods were the Apkallu, the wise ones, and there were 7 of them. The Apkallu were making it their task to educate the kings of Babylon. The kings of Babylon were so awesome because they were taught directly by the gods, and nobody else was. That's why you guys are like riffraff, and Babylon is just it. But some of the gods didn't like people. And so they decided, we're sick of these people, we're going to send the flood. And the gods who were educating people, they thought, well, that's just bad. That's terrible. All this work we did is going to go to waste. So what do we do? We will mate with humans, and their offspring will inherit our wisdom. And it'll be okay. And so on the other side of the flood, that's where you get people like Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is described as one of the post-flood lords of the Apkallu. He's also a giant. He's in this text. So you have point for point Genesis 6, 1 through 4 in that story as told by Babylonians. The biblical writer comes along and says, well, there's a lot in there that really needs to be corrected. Babylon is not it. In fact, what you think is so great were a race of beings that were designed to exterminate us, and almost did in the conquest. That's why you get the giant clans as part of the conquest story. According to Numbers 13, they are descendants of the Nephilim. The text says that point blank. So this is it helps us understand why Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is in the Bible, as bizarre as the passage is. It's there to say, this was wicked. This is evil. This was designed to exterminate the people of Yahweh. This is not a good thing. And the ones responsible for this are demonic. Okay? So it's a theological battle. It's a theological tit for tat going on in the text. And biblical writers often did this. They will take something out of a Mesopotamian story, out of an Egyptian story, out of a Canaanite story. And they know it well, and the people they're writing to know it well. But they'll take it out, and they'll change things to make a theological point. No, it isn't Baal who gives us rain and helps our crops grow and is a wonderful God, because we'd all be dead without Baal. So the biblical writer will take something out of the Baal cycle and take Baal's name out of it and put Yahweh's name in. That's their way of teaching theology. No, you're not alive because of Baal. You're alive because of the God of Israel. Baal is dirt. In some cases, literally, and even worse. They will do stuff like that because their audience, here's the point, their audience would have known immediately why they were doing it. They would have known immediately what they were supposed to learn from it and what they were supposed to believe and not believe. Folks, Israelites didn't have a Bible. Nobody had a Bible. You don't have people having Bibles until the modern era with the printing press. Nobody has a Bible. What you have is you got a bunch of crazy people called prophets running around and spouting stuff and quoting stuff that maybe they had read, or maybe another prophet taught them, or maybe they can trace their history back to Moses or something like that. Or maybe God just calls them and gives them information and says, go down there and preach this or that to them, and because they're just wicked down there. They need to hear this. Nobody can go look it up. So this is why you have biblical writers do what they do. When it does eventually get written down, to the people, again, that were experiencing it during the day. They could listen to a story, they could read it, and they know why things are written in a certain way, because they're living in that period. They know, they understand the metaphors. They understand the little phrases. I mean, if I could write anything that, it wouldn't be total gobbledygook, but if I put the word Trump in it, okay, that's going to situate me at a time and a place and a context. And you're going to know, by virtue of how I use the word Trump, whether I like him or don't. Because you're part of my world. I don't have to explain it to you. But we're not part of this world. And it takes a lot of explaining. It's hard. Let's take a look at some flood stories. Now, this is probably the one that you've all heard about, because maybe you've watched something on TV or PBS or whatever. And you hear about other versions of the flood. And there are several. So the dates, again, for a lot of this stuff, there are a number of ancient flood accounts in both Sumerian and Akkadian. These are both civilizations from Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates and all up and down those two rivers, from roughly 3000 BC. You hit about 1000 BC, and then you start talking about the Assyrians as being the top dog in the region. But before them, Sumerians, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. They're all from the same region, and most of them have flood stories. Here are a few examples. This one's called the Eridu Genesis. It's written in Sumerian. It's a flood story, with an ark and saving animals and all that kind of stuff. 1600 BC. Skip that one. Atrahasis epic, right around the same time. The Gilgamesh epic includes a flood story. The date range here is there's lots of copies of Gilgamesh. It was a very popular story. So the fragments that we have come from different time periods. So that's the date range. Now, I want you to look at this table. This is from Logos Bible Software. Ancient flood accounts. Here's Genesis. Here's the Eridu Genesis. Here's Gilgamesh. Here's Atrahasis. So you can see, if you just go through the flood accounts, which ones are similar and which ones maybe don't have something in it. So, again, God says, I've determined to make an end of all flesh. Well, Gilgamesh has the great gods resolved to send the flood and kill off everybody. Okay? Similar idea, make yourself an ark of cypress wood. This one mentions a ship you shall build. Build a ship, build a boat. Cover it inside and out with pitch. Here's pitch mentioned, here's pitch mentioned. Again, it's like that tarry kind of substance to seal the boat from water, make it waterproof. Make rooms in the ark. Okay, that's the only one that actually says this, but then you get dimensions in 3 of them. You get a roof in 3 of them. You get decks in 2 of them. On the same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, Noah's wife, the 3 wives of his sons, enter the ark. Here the family goes in, here's the family goes in. I mean, you get the idea. You can sort of go step by step through the flood story, and you see, pretty specific parallels. 40 days and 40 nights. Here you have differences in 7 and 6 and 7. Opens the window. Ziasudra drills an opening in the big boat. Sends a raven and a dove. Here they send a dove in Gilgamesh and a raven right down there. So you get both birds in the story. So again, that's probably pretty familiar because you see this all the time on TV shows and whatnot. And lo and behold, if you actually read the biblical story, where's the biblical story situated? Where's Noah living? He's living in Mesopotamia. I mean, some of the place names that are in the account, it's the same geographical region that these other ones are. And so the typical way that at least some scholars approach this is that all of these sources are writing about an event that they have a common memory of. And the stories are just different for either theological reasons or some other reason. But there's a lot of overlap. Now, this was in the news recently. A couple years ago, this book came out, probably 2 or 3 years ago, tops. But this is Irving Finkel. Okay? He works in the British Museum. And in 1985, somebody brought a tablet into him that he said, hey, my father had this. He got it in Iraq in the 40s. And Finkel, who all he does is read cuneiform tablets. And there are people like that. And some of them shake a lot. There was this guy when I went to grad school at Penn, I had to have a meeting with Earl Lichty. I think he's dead now, so I can talk about him. But he was the tablet keeper at where I was going to grad school, and he just like, is this because you're afraid to drop anything? Like they're going to shoot you or something? He was kind of a Wally Cox figure. That'll date me, but that's who he was. But this is Irving Finkel, and the owner would not let him study it. He wouldn't let him keep it. So he had to wait until 2009 when the guy finally brought it back in and said, okay, you guys can have it. And so that's why it made news. So he worked on the tablet, which he's holding. And in this story, the reason why this one is noteworthy is that it describes the boat. And Finkel argues, I think, pretty well, that in this story, the boat was something that archaeologists call a coracle. That's a coracle. It's a round boat. Now, of course, you need a really big one. This is a little one. Coracles are used all over, the region and other regions. Because, they'll float, they're round, you can kind of build that. Okay, it's not too difficult. So Finkel is theorizing that, this is what is being described in the story. A really big one with compartments, and you put the animals in there and you just kind of float it out. You wait and put a lid on the thing, and there you go. Somebody actually made a bigger one. Now, this is not to scale, but this gives you an idea. People who do this kind of thing, they really have too much time with their hands. How long did it take you to do this? Honey, I'm going to go build a coracle, a big one in my backyard. So I just want to see what it would look like. But that's why it was famous. Now, is that why do you get the dimensions of that in that Mesopotamian text? That's round, again, it has certain dimensions. That disagrees from the other Mesopotamian ones. Even they don't all agree. And of course, it disagrees with the biblical version. Because the biblical version is oblong. We've all seen pictures and reconstructions and whatnot. Again, and skeptical scholars will say, well, it doesn't mean anything because the event never happened. So that's all we need to say. Others will say, well, again, maybe the numbering systems have something to do with this because of Genesis 5, because of the Sumerian king list. Maybe there's something going on there that they used specific numbers and dimensions to communicate specific ideas. Nobody really knows. You can talk about which one is more shipworthy and all that. I think the biblical one's probably going to be the winner there. Can you imagine being in a coracle that big? All you're going to do is spin. Talk about vomit central. Okay, that would just be horrible. But anyway, I think that's graphic enough. This is another interesting object that you'll often see pictures of, like in high school textbooks, Western Civ textbooks. This is the Babylonian map of the world. Isn't that nice? You'll actually find maps that look a lot like this in the Middle Ages. So it's a very common conception. Now, here's the picture. Again, 6th century BC, one of the oldest known world maps discovered right around the turn of the 20th century. Another picture of it might be a little better, I don't know. Here's a hand drawing next to it. Babylon, of course, well, what would we expect? Babylon is at the center of the earth. That's where we belong. We're Babylon. The whole world revolves around us because we're just that important. We're just that good. We're just that awesome. So Babylon is at the center, and you have islands around. The world is surrounded by water. Here's a few cities, again in the region near Babylon, so on and so forth. This is a more detailed drawing of the actual object that labels the parts. hand drawing of the text, but you get the idea. Now, why is that interesting? How does that relate to Scripture? There are two reasons. One I think you'll get. The other one is like gold star for the day, if you pick this one out of your head. Give me one of them. The map of the world from a Mesopotamian source. We're in Genesis 1 to 11. Where's the touch point? Jed, do you know? He's speaking in tongues back there, yeah. The Table of Nations is one connection, because all the Table of Nations, now Israel's not listed in the Table of Nations, and that's an important biblical theological point for this time in history. So you don't have Israel as the center of the world, but what you do have is all the nations that are listed in the Table of Nations are the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle or Near East. Okay, all of them. You don't have Australia, New Zealand, North America, South America, Central America, Europe. You don't have that in the Table of Nations. So the world, to the biblical writer, is what Genesis 10 tells you it is. That's the world. The other correlation is in Ezekiel 38. You don't have to go there, but there are a couple. There's one in Jeremiah. No, there's two in Ezekiel. There might be one in Jeremiah. There's two in Ezekiel, where Jerusalem, or Israel, is called the navel of the earth. Okay, the conception was that Jerusalem is the center of the world. Why? Because it's the apple of God's eye. It's the most important place. By the way, Ezekiel written at the same time, 6th century BC. Okay, is Ezekiel poking Babylon in the eye? Probably. Can biblical writers do these kinds of things? When they write, they're not writing because they're bored. The Bible is an incredibly intricate, intelligent book. Nothing is in there that is trivial and accidental. Nothing is throwaway. It's just that a lot of it is lost on us because it is not our time and our place and our culture. Biblical writers do this stuff all the time. They are defending their faith. They are articulating their history. They are dissing your faith if you're a pagan. And they are correcting your history if it involves them in any unfavorable way. Because this is intellectual, spiritual warfare to them. When a biblical writer wrote, it wasn't just, I need to dispense information. I got half an hour. I'm supposed to fill up a scroll a day. What do I put here? Okay, no, it's not that at all. They have specific reasons for what they're saying and how they're saying it that would have been picked up, again, by their immediate audience. None of it's accidental. Tower of Babel. The leading candidate archaeologically is a place, actually an object known as Et Temenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth is what that term means. It's a ziggurat dedicated to Marduk. Again, here we are, 6th century BC. Ziggurat at Babylon is mentioned much earlier in Enuma Elish, so that's sort of a second candidate. But this is Et Temenanki, what's left of it, anyway. And ziggurats, which is what the Tower of Babel was, and everybody pretty much agrees on this point. Ziggurats are like step pyramids. Reconstruction, something like this. It's just an artistic rendering. Ziggurats were part of temple complexes. They were buildings designed to be the place where heaven and earth intersected. That's why you built them really high, to touch the sky, to make it easy for the gods to take the stairway down into the temple complex, so that you could localize the deity. You'd like him to visit, or her. Why? Because you hope that you can bring offerings and do nice things for the deity so that the deity does nice things for you. You know, the logic of the whole system is, I like to say it this way, you know, why, you know, the Old Testament has some of the same conceptual thinking in a place like the tabernacle or the temple, but you were never trying to localize Yahweh. See, in a ziggurat, typically at the top, there could be a room with a deity, a god, an idol, or somewhere else in the complex that when the spiritual being came down the stairway from heaven in this case, would inhabit the idol, and it would just stay there with you. And you could barter it with it, you could bring offerings to it, pour stuff on it, all that kind of stuff. The biblical rationale is no graven image. Why? It's a very simple lesson. Yahweh is saying, I will not be tamed. I will not be localized. I don't show up when you build something. I'm going to tell you, okay, if you want to communicate with me, then you go through the priest, or you go through Moses, or you go through this guy or that guy. I'm not just essentially, this isn't a dog and pony show. Okay, I will not be tamed. I am not on a leash. Okay, the logic of idolatry, what Israel was doing in their structures is, there's some conceptual sameness, but there's some really significant differences to it too. And when you have this episode with Babel, what had God just told them to do? Okay, we're out of the flood now. You're starting to have babies. So I'm going to repeat the commands given to Eden. Go overspread the earth, be fruitful, multiply, and do what we were supposed to do back there in Eden. So what do? Let's build a tower so that God can come to us. And God says, no, I don't really think so. That's kind of the opposite of what I just asked you to do. And so that's when God punishes them, and we have the whole thing about distributing the nations among the other gods in Deuteronomy 32 and all that kind of stuff. It's a punishment. God divorces humanity. He says, I'm done. Mostly. Because then he calls Abraham. I'm divorcing all of you. All the nations. Your toast, your history. I'm going to assign you, Deuteronomy 32:8 says, when the Most High divided the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted heritage. So he divorces humanity, and then he says, now watch. I'm going to go call this guy named Abraham. He doesn't know I'm coming yet, but I'm going to show up. I'm going to call him, and I'm going to start over. I'm going to make a new family with this guy. And when he does that, he makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says, okay, through you, all these other nations will be blessed. I'll get back to them eventually. But for now, they are under the dominion of lesser gods, and you're mine. I want you to be a kingdom of priests. I want you to live a certain way so that they will look at you and want to be back in the family. And there's a rationale, there's a logic to all this crazy law stuff in the Old Testament. It's either combating certain ideas, or it creates a good life for people that other nations will look at and want. You want a good God who treats these people well and people who are happy because they obey the laws of God. You want that? You forsake your gods and come right back here. That's what you do. So again, there's just an internal logic to the whole thing. Now that's what I wanted to cover tonight. I mean, if we want to go through some Q&A, we can. And again, that was pretty broad. We're actually over time, a couple minutes. But next week I want to do the patriarchs, say a little bit about the patriarchs. But I want to focus on Joseph and Moses and the Exodus problem. There's a lot to be said there. There's a lot of problems associated with it. But if you've seen the Ten Commandments, if you've seen, what is the recent Christian Bale movie, Gods and Kings, the one where Jar Jar Binks plays the Egyptian priest. Any of you have seen that will get that reference. Not a whole lot of takers here, but I hate the movie. Or again, even the cartoon version. There are things in all those presentations of the Exodus that, whether you realize it or not, are either reinforcing a certain reading of the Bible or opposing a certain reading of the Bible. So we'll talk about a lot of that next week. Anybody? Question? Okay, we're done. Thank you for coming.